to sell weapons in Africa and West Asia. India sees both these regions as key markets.
I'm here on an IT mission, and our approach to Africa today is to trade more with Africa. Agreement to establish the Indian Institute of Technology's campus here in Zanzibar,
where EM Dr. S. Shankar takes a dig on China during interaction with the Indian community in Tanzania.
Namaste. Today's episode is going to be very interesting because we are going to explore how India is strategically increasing its footprints in Africa. We'll also know the thought process behind it. In the month of June this year, a conclave held in New Delhi, where India and ministers of many African countries participated. At that conclave, India's External Affairs Minister said,
India believes in forging a development partnership with Africa that is based on the needs and priorities of our partners.
But before we get into the meat of the matter, let us first examine how were the relations between India and Africa in the past. The trade relations between India and Africa date back to the Bronze Age. Evidences suggest that Africans came to India as early as 4th century. But it was during the 1200s to 1400s when a large number of Africans arrived in India. It was the time when Islamic rulers imported them as slaves, army chiefs, harem keepers and dancers. Even the Portuguese and the Britishers in India continued the slave trade and imported many of the African slaves. Oh, surprised. Must be wondering, if so many slaves arrived in India, where are the subsequent generations? And why haven't we heard about them in our history books, right? Okay, let us know the answers.
The Arab slave trade in East Africa is one of the oldest, stretching back 700 years before the European transatlantic slave trade.
The answer is that you have heard their name without realizing that they were of African descent. One of them was Jamaluddin Yaqut, famous for his alliance with Razia Sultan. He was Ethiopian. Malik Ambar, who served as the Peshwa of Ahmednagar Sultanate, was again of African descent. Siddhi Johar, famous for his battle against Chhatrapati Shivaji, was again of African descent. It is estimated that there are around 50,000 Siddhis living in India, and Hirabai Lobi, who was awarded the Padma Shri this year, became the first Siddhi woman to win the Padma Award.
The one thing which bound India and Africa was that both regions were fighting against colonization, and when India gained independence, it became the leading voice in support of decolonization of Africa. In 1964, India had launched the Indian Technical and Economic Corporation (ITEC) program to provide technical assistance to developing countries, and Africa was the biggest beneficiary of this program. Relations between India and Africa were more or less based on the common history of colonization until the 90s. In the 90s, when privatization and liberalization happened in India, Africa and India started focusing more on trade and economics.
In 2010-11, the Indian-African trade was 51.7 billion. In 2019-20, it rose up to 66.7 billion, and in fiscal year 2022-2023, the bilateral trade reached almost 100 billion USD. The goal of Indian government is to double the trade volume to 200 billion USD by 2030. Even the Indian private sector is investing in Africa, and India has become one of the top 5 investors in Africa now.
You must be wondering, who is the largest investor in Africa? And the answer is China. In the latter half of the segment, we'll discuss about the projects India is investing in Africa and its long-term strategy. But the important question to answer here is, why India has so much interest in Africa? And the answer is again, China. Today, the biggest trade partner of Africa is China. And in 2022, China-Africa trade reached $282 billion, which is almost 11% increase from 2021. China's plan is to increase its trade with African nations to $300 billion by 2025. China has invested in roads, railways, infrastructure, factories, oil and gas, almost everything which is humanly possible. All these projects are developing the infrastructure in Africa, which is true. But what does China want in return? China knows that the African countries cannot pay back the debt. So there has to be something which China wants in return. And it seems that Africa has made a deal with the devil. What does the devil want? Let us probe deeper.
And Chinese debt is a huge issue in Africa. First, look at the magnitude of the problem. Africa owes over $700 billion to external lenders.
In 2020, China held over $73 billion of Africa's public debt. and nearly 9 billion USD of private debt. Africa has a lot of mineral-rich nations, and China, with all its investments, has access to all these natural resources, particularly oil and gas. More than 1/3 of China's oil comes from Africa, and also 20% of China's cotton. Africa also has half of world's stock of manganese, which is used in steel, and half of planet's cobalt, which is possessed by Congo. It also has huge amount of coltan, which is used in electronics. African nations are happy to give China access to all their natural resources because they are getting roads, railways, infrastructure, which they desperately need.
In November 2021, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi praised China for constructing nearly 100 ports in Africa, though the number in public records is much higher. These ports are built by Chinese firms, and these firms have full ownership of operational control of these ports. In fact, the Chinese Army, People's Liberation Army, has built a base in Djibouti. Chinese firms have either built or financed, or they have invested in 61 separate port facilities in 30 African states. This leaves only 8 coastal or island African states that do not host some Chinese port infrastructure. This control enables China to monitor Indian Ocean and Atlantic Ocean. The chart on your screen shows the geographic distribution of Chinese ports in Africa.
Not just ports, China has also heavily invested in railway projects in Africa. Some of the examples of the completed railway projects are the Tanzania-Zambia railway projects, Ethiopia-Djibouti railway projects, and Addis Ababa light rail. The figure on your screen will explain how deep in Africa these railway line runs, and as you can see from this gives China access to landlocked parts of Africa and also make transportation of natural resources to the ports easier.
The last reason is geopolitical supremacy. After the nationalists were defeated by the communists in China, there was a constant battle between the two to get recognized by the nations. At one point, Taiwan was recognized by 20 African countries and China by 22. Today, the scene has changed. China has 54 allies out of 55 African nations, whereas Taiwan has only 1.
Of course, there are also diplomatic tensions to watch as well. We've seen Honduras taking the side of Beijing, and as a consequence, Taiwan really losing an ally that has been with it for decades.
As we have clearly established, China's interest in Africa is majorly due to 3 reasons: access to natural resources, maintaining control over 2 major sea routes, and gaining crucial geopolitical allies. Is India doing anything to counter that? What are the steps Indian government taking to improve its relation with Africa? We will explore that further. In 2018, at a speech in Ugandan Parliament, Prime Minister Modi mentioned 10 guiding principles for India-Africa engagement. Africa will be at the top of our priorities. Prime Minister Modi mentioned that.
But in the last few decades, China has taken over. It has turned Africa into its playground, invested billions of dollars, built roads, bridges, power plants, basically entered every business in practically every country. And what did China get in return? Abundant resources and an untapped market. The West is waking up to this, and India is making some moves.
India's main export to Africa are refined petroleum products and pharmaceuticals, while Africa primarily exports crude oil, gold, coal, and other minerals. The government has provided millions of dollars in educational and humanitarian aid to African countries, which strengthens India's soft power. The Indian government is extending lines of credit at concession price to African nations, and as of March 2022, a total of 12.37 billion USD have been given to 42 African countries. Health, digital, and green growth are the 3 sectors where India and Africa are strengthening their partnership. Few projects which India has invested in are construction of Presidential Office in Ghana, National Assembly Building in Gambia, Kosti Power Plant in Sudan, Rift Valley Textile Factories in Kenya, water treatment projects in Tanzania, sugar factories in Ethiopia, and IT parks in Mozambique and Eswatini.
Clean energy forms an important part of India's plan, and India has invested in solar projects by partnering with African Development Bank to develop 10,000 megawatt of solar power systems across the Sahel region. It aimed at improving electricity access for Africans. The Union Minister for Commerce recently said that India's digital innovation such as UPI and ONDC can help Africa in its digital revolution. The most successful example of India-Africa Digital Tech Corporation has been the Pan-African E-Network project that was operational in 48 African nations. It basically connects African nations to Indian hospitals and educational institutes.
India is known as the pharmacy of the world, and almost 20% of India's pharmaceuticals exports, valued at approximately 17 billion, are to Africa. During the COVID-19 outbreak, India supplied made in India vaccines, essential life-saving drugs, test kits, gloves, PPE kits and medical equipments to many African nations. India is exploring opportunities for joint manufacturing facilities of vaccines in African nations. India, along with South Africa, had appealed to WTO to allow patent waiver for vaccines so that developing countries could manufacture medical products and COVID-19 vaccines. Later on, USA also backed India on this proposal.
India and China both have similar interests in Africa, and both countries are trying to boost their soft power. China has a head start over India, and India has a lot of catching up to do, even though there are parallels between the strategies of both the countries. Let us see what makes India different from China. China has invested a lot of money in Africa in manufacturing and natural resources, whereas India is focusing on healthcare, education and IT. It can be said that both are playing to their strengths. China has been welcomed with open arms in Africa, but some labor unions are opposing China because they provide poor labor conditions, unsustainable labor practices, and there has been a loss of jobs because Chinese firms employ a lot of Chinese workers. Angola, Ghana, Gambia and Kenya have seen demonstrations against Chinese funded projects. Even in Congo, public concern is growing about the loans for projects that are never built. While on the other hand, Indian firms employ Africans in their projects, which leads to more jobs for the locals. Gareth Price, a South Asian expert, wrote that India says it does not interfere in the affairs of sovereign states. Its motto is ask us what you need and we'll see what we can do. If India is doing something, it does it with local labor rather than importing workers from their home like the Chinese do.
Another advantage which India has over China is cultural proximity with Africa. English is still a widely spoken language in Africa, and Indians have better command over English than the Chinese. There are 3 million Indians living in Africa since generations, which can also help bridge the gap. In 2020, Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan said India is opening 18 new embassies in Africa. Right now, India has embassies only in 29 African nations out of 54, and by adding 18 to the tally, India will have embassies in 47 African nations. In Africa, you can hear voices which support democracy, and India is the largest democracy in the world, which gives another advantage to India over China. Hopefully, Indian government will try to leverage all these advantages in their favor.
As of now, India cannot compete with China in terms of economic investment, and India has a long way to go to catch up with China. The positive thing for India is that there is growing realization in Africa that their terms of agreement with China can lead to a disaster, and when Africa looks for a suitable substitute, they won't look farther than their oldest friend, India. Thank you for watching. Do subscribe to the channel. We'll meet you next week. Take care.